Welcome to this week's FHIR Analytics Group meeting. So we have a number of things outstanding. Actually, I think this has been like the biggest rush of topics for some time. They all came at once. It's like a bus, you know. But I wanted to start off with talking about our ideas around how do we encapsulate queries to begin with, maybe stay with that. But beyond that, if we get to a point where we want to talk about something else, we have a couple of other things, I think somewhat smaller, but also important. A lot of them, John, you've been posting about past couple of days. So things about the FHIR subset, some different issues around column type and potentially some new directives. And then the API draft progress. I saw, Steve, you posted some questions about the run operation. So maybe, Nikolai, I don't know if you had a chance to make any progress on that, or maybe we can take a few minutes to talk about that.
Yeah, I hope next week I will finalize API. Sorry, guys.
Okay. That sounds good. And I know, Steve, you just posted a couple of questions. It does look like, folks are taking a look at that, at the API, and you're getting, some good feedback there. So is there anything you need from the group right now, Nikolai, or anything sort of outstanding that we could help with?
Yeah, let me prepare the draft, because I think like mentally it's ready. I just have to push myself and write it down. Yeah, so we have two operations, run and export.
Okay.
Yeah, and we will discuss with Steve. I think I agree with everything what was said.
Okay, great. So we'll look forward to that. And before we jump in, any other topics from the group that we wanted to touch on today?
I think the query resource, recursion directive, discuss the run operation. I think the hottest is query resource. Yeah.
It is. All right. So let's see where we get to. But let's talk about query resource in air quotes. Unfortunately, Brian could not make it today. He was going to present sort of our viewpoint here. So I'm gonna be batting for Brian, but we've been watching the discussion, obviously, in Zulip, but maybe you can just take a moment and just talk about the use cases that we're thinking about. And we're interested in using library, primarily to fit, I think, within how clinical resources, clinical reasoning resources are currently defined, and they already use library references to point to logic. So that's kind of the heart of the use case. But there's some that are kind of more specific in terms of use cases. So for instance, we want to refer to SQL queries from within a FHIR measure. We want to refer to SQL queries to pre-populate a FHIR questionnaire. We want to use SQL queries to select the inclusion criteria for like a plan definition. And then we want to refer to SQL queries for dynamic values within activity definitions. And so there's a kind of idea throughout the clinical reasoning resources where there's a kind of expression language, right? And one of the and talk about FHIR path, query, and CQL being expression language. I think in a sense we see SQL statements as an expression language as well, or as a logic / expression language. So that's sort of like where our use cases, the origin of our use cases. So I wanted to at least present that out there, because we never really talked about that in general, and get your feedback on that.
I think it seems like a really cool idea. I'm just trying to imagine how it all sort of fits together end to end. Maybe we could sort of come up with a sort of example use case where we bring together a number of these resources together and sort of describe them using these resources and describe the operations we use on them at different times. And I think that would be really nice way of illustrating what you're shooting for.
Yeah, I like the idea of library source. The things which I don't like, I told it to Brian that it's base 64. That's what I don't like because you could not read resource from it. Yeah, so it and probably we need maybe some demo how it's used in SQL. Really, yes. So are the guys putting everything into library resources like with the SQL program so that it how it's structured?
I think, I mean, I think the base 64 issue, I mean, that's a base 64 representation of the expression, right? It's
Yeah.
it's the base 64 encoding of that
The
expression.
expression is the heart of the query resource. If people have to decode it all the time, they're looking at the query, so then it's not the best choice. We can make some extension. I don't know, extend the type of data or how content, how it's called this field.
Yeah, let me put up put this in the chat. This is Brian's gist, and I can share screen too. And I think, you know, don't rely on me as the as the end statement here, but I mean, my understanding is that that the data element, which is base 64 encoded, is simply the base 64 encoding of the thing that's an expression, right? Like that's the intent there, which it you know, obviously that's it in two places, but I think that is one issue that's clearly there. And then the other one is kind of related to what John was saying. Like if we were to use SQL expressions within sort of the clinical reasoning framework, what would that look like? How would it, I don't know, potentially interact with expressions in other languages? But so I think that's something that we could probably do and make some examples that document and make it more clear what this is like, so that all of us can visualize it better. I think that's a good idea.
Is there a way in library resource to describe the output?
So, I mean, there's data requirement. Yeah, I'm looking at it right now.
This is for incoming, yes, because the query gonna output some stuff, yes. So
yeah, I think that ties in with like my concern is the clinical reasoning framework. All of that is a very built up and very modeled space. And so I think where we're running into is the two types of use cases running into each other. That, you know, in library, it's set up for, you know, libraries with named components and, you know, assembling manifests and doing all these things, which is very useful in that space and necessary in that space. But it's very much in conflict with, hey, I just want to run SQL. And so you lose some of that simplicity. And so I think that's, you know, trying to decide where we want that to fall, whether it's one, the other, both, you know, saying, yeah, these are two different use cases and we need to figure out how to work with both and then make sure we have a good integration path or different things like that, because definitely getting clinical reasoning to abandon library is a non-starter, I would argue. But at the same time, forcing anyone who wants to use SQL into that whole library and management framework feels like a big lift. And that's kind of where I am. Is I don't know how to resolve that yet.
Yeah, no, I think going through this, looking at each example, like you can kind of start to see that tension, because use cases are coming at from pretty distinct places with some more crystallized structure than others, and I think that's what you're saying. So yeah, definitely agree with that. I think we all have to kind of process this in our heads and start to think of what a range of solutions might be. And I'm just thinking about it, and you know, potentially it's not just one, right? So as much as we want to keep things simple, you know, the circumstances and the existing work might push us in that direction. So, Gene, you got your hand up.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Nice to see everyone. I think I was on one time before, but thanks, Arjun, for inviting me to the group. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to add for this particular library use case, from my experience at what we implemented, we used it strictly as a CQL container. So basically just a resource that has the hash value of the SQL code itself. So to the point of it's not specific to SQL, you could kind of put anything in there as long as it's just a hash value that you translate. So that's kind of like what we used it for. And I think that it was very useful because a library can be connected to many different things that describe the actual code in the library. So we could like create a measure. We could create a measure, obviously measure report, things like that, that then go along with, context that you want to give to that. So I just wanted to add that. It's kind of like the SQL use case, but there's no reason why it couldn't be used for SQL per my thinking.
May I ask you a question? So if you want just to run piece of SQL code, so how you run it? What the API for that? Just you have just like a couple of expressions and you want to run them. Are you always packing them into library and after that sending to the server, or you have a shortcut API for that?
In the SQL use case or just the SQL use case?
I mean in SQL, yeah. So you have it just like one, I don't know.
Yeah, so you would have one executable block per library. So like it's essentially executing one-to-one every time you want to run it. And then you basically have a new library for every piece of logic or code or query that you want to run. So like that's how we would basically have, you can call them Lego blocks that kind of like stored procedures, right? That you generically have that execute some bigger measure. So you can have those stored procedures be a piece of SQL code that you could run by themselves, like somebody a diabetic. So then you would run just to understand if they're diabetic. And then you could have other libraries that reference that SQL code, right? So then the SQL engine itself just executes that. And it's the same way essentially that a SQL, engine would run as well, right? You have a whole bunch of...
Are you always wrapping your expression into library when you want to run it?
Yes, at least that's how we implemented it. And it has its own, each library has its own URI or whatever. And then you would basically call that. That's what, per my understanding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you generally don't even directly evaluate a library, you evaluate a measure that uses the libraries and components, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
It's all part of that. Yeah, clinical reasoning structure. Yeah.
And yeah, that's where I was saying that's
It's like
a very well described and well modeled space that's building all these things, essentially calling functions from in DLLs and building all that space up to get to measures and all those pieces. But I don't know that I've come across just evaluate CQL.
Yeah, I don't believe that is. I might not be. I mean, I don't know everything about the definition, but I think it's almost universally wrapped in a library, just because you're not going to do it in a one-off manner, right? You're going to have an entire library, right, or group of code that you want to run that's going to have to be packaged somehow, that's going to have metadata around it, right? People just don't write like, okay, I'm going to write this like SQL one-liner, right? And so I don't think any operations support it in that way either.
No, and
yeah, just can build everything as a library so that then you can call it as a library. So it could be like, from small to large, essentially, like pieces, and you could even group them like using measures. You could like associate versions. You could do versioning. You could do like, this is part of this particular subject area. So like diabetes measures or something, or queries about this particular area. And then you can group them using the measure resource.
And I think part of that complexity comes because in CQL, it's mixing the layers that we have distinct in SQL. That the CQL runner is kind of embedded because you take the CQL to the Elm and then to the evaluation, and you need to put the things that can actually collect and parse resources and feed them in and all those things. And that's all kind of tied up. And that's why you end up with like the measure, because you have the evaluation engine kind of tightly coupled to the CQL evaluation and everything else. Whereas in SQL, we delegate all of that to the SQL server, and then we just have the definitions. And so there's kind of a little bit of a conceptual disconnect there, even though the use cases are very well aligned, I think.
Yeah, and just to point out, CQL builds on SQL overall the framework of like how this has been done for years and years and years. Talk about HEDIS measures particularly, right? It's been done the same way for 15, 20 years. That it's just you have HEDIS vendors that have built SQL databases that CQL is trying to create a standardized version of what has existed before. So kind of like the structure of that is all based on how HEDIS measures have been built for years and years and years. So I think what the SQL on FHIR effort does is kind of create a FHIR version of that, right? Without going to the CQL, without needing CQL to run that logic, right? It's basically like if you don't have a CQL engine and you don't have a way to run CQL, you have another definition that you could use to then run it on your own side, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to align because CQL embeds all of the extraction logic and everything else. That's why it's just a very tightly coupled set of all these pieces in my mind. And so that's why I'm trying to figure out, but I can see where you're going.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, this is maybe me talking a little bit off the cuff, but like, firstly, I think we think CQ like doesn't. I'm not even saying CQL. Like CQL is the logic language, but we want to use it in all the places that it's being used right now throughout sort of the clinical reasoning space, right? So it's not just measures in our view, questionnaires, plan definitions, activity definitions, CPG, like that. Those use cases are really critical for us. So I almost see it like, in one sense, it's we want to make those polyglot, right? But they happen to be currently tied to this specific container resource. So it's hard for me to see how we're gonna tie a new expression language to this container resource because there's no real there's no slots for it. There's not like a lot of optionality and pluggability here. I think that's kind of what Gino is getting at in a different way of saying it. And so for us, like and I think as a group too, we want to do this. I don't think it's just particular to us, where you would want someone who is writing questionnaires or writing clinical practice guidelines and CDS to have the option, right? So,
but
the way FHIR is right now.
What the semantic of the library? It's a set of, how you call it, functions, or in SQL, or like statements, yes? So what is like a mental model of the library? It's a set of statements in SQL, yes?
I mean, it's not, I don't think it's tied specifically to CQL, right? It's a general purpose container.
What else could be in this container? What else could be in this container? Anything?
I think anything, yeah. Any language. That's what I'm trying to say. It's like, let's distinguish.
Why it's called a library? Okay, so then what the mental model of the library? So for me, the library is a set of functions, or set of classes, or set of something, which is not like active. Yeah, so I have to call something from this library. Yeah, so I can imagine a library of views. So that I have a library of views, so I can call on top of these views like some SQL, or because what I see, like you have a library of SQL expressions. And then when you want to run, you're writing some expression on top of this library, which may call statements from the SQL library. And you get a final result, yes?
I think that's the right model. And, you guys jump in as well, but I think that's the right model. It's a generic container, right? With some specificity for, in particular, like authoring and publishing, things like that. But the language of the logic contained by the container is not specifically CQL, right? But there's some kind of niceties around that. So I think that's the right, like a library of views, or a library of lots of different kinds of resources. So
yeah, maybe they don't contradict, because we can publish some libraries. We can even put like operation definition or query resource or the view definition inside the library. But
that's a potential.
So for me, it's like the library not equal to the query. Yeah. So it's not the same. So the query means query. Yes. So I'm querying something, and I can package my query into the library. That's okay. So, and we can discuss this potentially. I can even package my views into the library and like a lot of stuff. Yes.
Yeah, I
think
agree.
that's how we're intending for it. Go ahead.
Sorry. I think that we can look at these things separately. Like, so there's the interface to clinical, the way that you do SQL and FHIR in clinical reasoning. And there's other stuff. Like if we want to have a way of representing queries for SQL and FHIR, that doesn't necessarily have to exclusively be the way that we interface with SQL and FHIR in clinical reasoning. So I don't think we have to put all our, I don't think we need to get too upset about like if this is the way we have to represent things for clinical reasoning and that doesn't really perfectly meet our needs for other use cases for SQL and FHIR. I don't think that's a huge deal, actually. I think going back to what Gino said, we can have multiple things here. I think we should create ideas for whatever we need, and I don't think we should totally. I don't think we have to have everything satisfied by the library. I think it's a great idea to have a way of the clinical reasoning stuff being able to reference like SQL and FHIR SQL queries, SQL and FHIR view definitions. But if we need something like a query resource or a query logical model, we should think about what does SQL and FHIR need in terms of metadata around a query. I mean, that should be the first step really, is to think about what's needed from a SQL and FHIR ecosystem point of view. How does that get satisfied? And then the solution to come out of that, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I just think there's constraints in the clinical reasoning ecosystem that you can't get around, right? So there has to be support for these use cases, but that doesn't preclude a different structure or encapsulation that is more tuned.
Another analogy can be that, so why you're not putting every statement of SQL into the library, yes? So that's the question, yes, because our query is essentially a kind of one statement.
Yeah, it allows multiple content strings, so you could have many base64 strings technically embedded, I think, in a library.
I think that, yeah, we can just think how we can encapsulate queries into the library, but this is not about the queries. So we can even encapsulate the whole resource into this base64 and say it has a name and you can call it by name or something like this.
So you're saying something along the lines of maybe there's like maybe not 2-tier is the wrong model, but like a simple, right, kind of very focused query resource, but that can be embedded in the library.
Yeah, you can base64 it and put into the library. Yeah, like you're doing this with the SQL. And then you may call it in the CPG workflows or other stuff. So, because you're not putting every SQL expression into the library. Yes. So you structure it in a different way. So, and you can call it outside of library. So this is not the only way to call SQL. Yes.
But as we're talking, how much standardization do we expect from the simple case? Like if I want to write an SQL statement, it is tied to a view definition.
Yeah.
And so I can't just generically execute SQL because the table names are different and the column names are different and all these different things. CQL bypasses that because it's based on the FHIR model directly, and that's why it's integrated the parser and the executable environment. So
it's still not that true, as I understand, because the SQL FHIR is just one part of SQL. Yeah, so you may run SQL on top of.
Yeah, you can run it on any object model you want, but I'm saying in the case of like the HEDIS measures or things like that, the point is that the CQL is generic because it's mapped to the FHIR models, or even the US core models on top of the FHIR models, or different things like that. Whereas we lose that in SQL because we have the view definition in between. And so how common is it that we're really going to be passing around generic SQL statements once we get past the kind of testing phase? Or do we need to build up all the library things so that we can say, yeah, here are the view definitions and here are the SQL statements so that you can pair together and track together and all that kind of stuff? Are we going to end up in that space anyway? In which case, then we probably don't want to spend too much time standardizing the simple case if we know we're going to end up in the complicated one. I don't know.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is that even just in SQL and FHIR land, we need a way of expressing dependencies between queries and views. And are you saying it's worthwhile sort of inheriting that infrastructure because we're going to have to invent it anyway?
Maybe that's what I'm asking, is saying, you know, right now we've talked a lot about, oh, I'm just using an SQL statement, but in order to do that, you have to know what view definitions are there and everything else. So we have the case that we already have pretty well described about running a query against the view definition. And we don't need a ton more on that front, I don't think. That seems to work pretty well. I don't know if people want to accept it or if we want to look at stored procedures and different things like that to make that more palatable. Great. But when we look at, like, the link I posted there was from the common SQL assets for FHIR, and they have libraries like the US Core Common Assets. And so they are saying, okay, well, here are a bunch of SQL statements already packaged together that work on the US Core stuff, and it's what you need to evaluate against US Core. And if that's the direction we're going to end up building, saying, well, here's a set of view definitions for US Core or something like that, and the equivalent SQL statements, I would rather not reinvent the whole library architecture to do that type of grouping and packaging and all those types of bits and pieces that you want to selectively execute from.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were to say, I think it's where, so if you're starting from the very simplest case, right, like a string that has SQL in it, and you are going to have to expand, you know, have metadata, you know, you're going to have, I think, I'm not sure, in our current examples, we have reference to the view definition or something like that. I think maybe it's in there, but I think it's where do you stop and say, okay, well, everything else beyond this, go to library, right? There's a robust infrastructure for that.
And we should challenge the library and this SQL all knowledge management stuff against our use cases. For example, if I just want to, like, simple report, yes, like, let's say some group by and I want to get the report, is there tooling in SQL how I can express it? So can I, what it means in SQL if I just want, like, I don't know, patient age and the most popular, I don't know, condition for this age, or like, or I don't know, condition and the, like, most popular medication. So how can I do this in SQL? Or there is no infrastructure for that to get this report, just as plain table?
That's what would be the measure. So the measure defines the measure report, which is what you're talking about. And the measure report is basically the structured output of that.
But it wouldn't be a table, right?
But
So
it's going to be table, yes. In case of measures, I understand it's mostly like numbers, yeah, like one number or something like this. So it could be more complicated.
It could
can
be more.
be.
It's like just it's a representation of any kind of data that you can output, you know, from any FHIR resource, and it goes up to different aggregation levels, things like that. But yeah, to your point, it's basically not. It's like still FHIR. So a measure report is still FHIR. So maybe you have a view definition on the measure report that turns it into a table, right? So it's like, essentially, I'm thinking of SQL on FHIR as a flattening of FHIR.
Yeah,
maybe
we can produce any, like, structure, yes. So it's kind of flat, and after the SQL query, it can be like, it is not FHIR. We can push it into, like, basic resource or use parameter resource to represent, but this is not natural representation for the results, like CSV or like some simple JSON, which is not completely not FHIR, yes. So with the custom schema is what the output of our report, and that's what probably people are expecting to do. And is there any way, so because in measure, yeah, so you always respond with the FHIR, yes? And you created this measure resource to provide these responses from metrics, yes, and all this stuff. So, but in our case, we can produce like arbitrary data structures and collections of something. And I think maybe you can work with Brian and the SQL group to try to fit these use cases, or maybe expand them for us, because like Gina said, it looks like it's very modeled domain, yes, so and
well,
not
part of the
enough
thing that I
space.
know
Yeah.
we were doing is we were actually trying to flatten, because measure report, one of the issues is that it's not fit for use for analytics, for analysts to use out of the box. So you still have to flatten it and get it into a relational table, right, Arjun? And it's like that whole issue of payers have developed all of their data warehouses, their dashboards, everything on relational databases. So that's one of the big problems with this DCS product that Arjun, right? Like the NCQA, is that they just like, oh, here's a FHIR, and then how do we use this measure report? We don't know how to flatten. So I feel like that's where a skill on FHIR comes in, and it's like, yes, you have all this data in FHIR. Now you apply a skill on FHIR, and boom, it's now in flatten with the view definitions. And here's already the views created on top of that, where your analysts can go in and use that data, right? It's not, I don't think it's replacing the measure report, but it's also helping add value to that, to utilize that, if I'm thinking about it correctly.
It's semantically, it is not just measure report. It could be just data report, like some kind of report.
Yeah, so, but it's almost like it's helping utilize that.
Yeah.
So it's like without a skill on FHIR, CQL is hard for people to use. That's the whole like problem with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nikolai, you're pointing out something that needs investigation, because it's not the natural fit with how these tools and infrastructure work today, right? Because they're outputting FHIR resources, like that is the output. And I was looking to see if there's any optionality there, but I don't think there is. And so, like, I think it's something like I think it's, in my mind, at least at this stage, it's more than one thing, right? There's probably a simple encapsulation that we keep really tight, that expresses the query in a really straightforward way, expresses the output in a really straightforward way. That's like the simple resource, and maybe that can bring in some of the other requirements that people are talking about around search and things like that. And then that resource gets encapsulated, like can be encapsulated into a library, right? Like that seems like a model that probably has the least number of rough edges. But I mean, there's definitely a case where you want to express the query, maybe the view definition inline as well, I don't know, and then the output format can't, I don't think it makes sense if the output format then has to be processed again, right? It should sort of be like one unit in my mind. That's sort of the analytic case idea. It's like, here's your view definition, here's your query, and here's some definition of any structured output, non-FHIR output. In my mind, that's like the kind of minimum requirements there.
Yeah. And if the guy is ready to incorporate it into the like SQL and CRMI specs, that's okay. We can try to fit it. But if we could not express even simple stuff, like, so then there's a lot of question. Can we reuse this structure?
I mean, maybe there's something I'm missing, but John has his hand up actually.
So I'm not an expert on this CRMI thing, but from my reading of it is it's not dependent on libraries or anything like that to express dependencies. In fact, there's dependencies between other things. For example, like questionnaires are dependent on value sets that they reference. So there's no reason that if we had like view concept and a query concept, that couldn't fit into the concept of CRMI dependency management, from what I can see, without having to kind of integrate ourselves into the whole clinical quality measure library thing. I just kind of wanted to
No,
know
I keep
that.
those two things. Yeah, I keep those two things separate, right? The CRMI artifact packaging management is totally separate from the clinical reasoning, I think, ecosystem. It's that the reasoning ecosystem probably relies the most on CRMI just because there's lots of artifacts and dependencies. So, but those two things are very distinct. There's no question that you could use the CRMI packaging, authoring packaging, distribution infrastructure totally independently of library or anything like that.
I will push back a tiny bit.
Maybe.
Just because we've been having a lot of arguments about this over the past year or two. But the CRMI stuff, the computable, publishable, executable, all of that is classified around CQL. And so it's very hard to integrate into that ecosystem if you don't align with that. And that's something we've been trying to reconcile, because as we've tried to genericize it and say this applies to everything, what does executable mean? In the case of CQL, that's why there's a very clear definition of what executable means. But that is not at all clear when you talk about anything else. And so all those types of things we've been trying to push back. So there's some work to be done there. Not that it's impossible. It's just that we need to be aware that there is work to be done if we want to just plug in.
Yeah, I guess, that's fair. I would say, I think they were sort of co-developed and sort of evolved together, right? So there's probably linkages there, but let me ask you, Gino, just overall in terms of, the broad consensus is that, and I'm asking you is if this is your feeling, but the broad consensus is that the CRMI infrastructure should move towards a more generic, non-CQL.
For sure. Yeah. That's why we've been pushing back on it, is saying we want to make sure that these things can be general applicable. And there's, where do the profiles actually live? Because they can't actually live in core, but we want them to. And we want to start enforcing dependencies in authors and make sure that they're attributing things correctly. There's tons of arguments about manifests and all that kind of stuff. We had another fun series of those at Dev Days. So there's all of these pieces. And so it's definitely work in progress, but I also don't want to say, oh, we can just plug into it and we're, happy path. There's more to be done than that.
Sure. That makes sense. Gene?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think this is one thing that Arjun and I talked about before, is the pain points I had with particularly US core resources and trying to get the data reportable and flattened. That's a huge pain point, right? So there's almost a subset of FHIR resources that I would say are SQL on FHIR executable or primary, or whatever you want to call them. And then there's all those other resources in FHIR, which was 150, 160 resources. Not all of them are going to be SQL on FHIR relevant. So maybe there's maybe that's another resource filter or identifier on all the FHIR resources in the whole base spec that make them SQL on FHIR compatible. And maybe that's what makes that extendable, because really SQL on FHIR, you're taking FHIR and extending it, right? So that's where I was also going with some of this work that I was trying to show, and I haven't been able to hop on this call, unfortunately, but to be able to create view definitions from FHIR profiles automatically. And Arjun, I can show the
yeah, I mean,
or next time.
Maybe next time.
But ultimately, that kind of stuff, you can basically use any implementation guide and any FHIR profile, and then create a SQL on FHIR version of it, and then flatten it, because that's what is that was my biggest pain point, is just getting the data from FHIR into, Databricks, Postgres, MySQL, you name it, right? DBT. And then after that, you could get all these complex use cases, which is, I want to write a custom query. I want to write a custom view definition. How to identify diabetics in this particular cohort, which requires all the logic together, right? So I think there's levels of, and maybe those are all different types of view definitions, right? I don't know. I haven't seen what's already been defined, but to me, that's you're making FHIR more usable with every.
Shall we spend some time on Gina's idea about operation definition?
Yeah, I mean, given that discussion, I think it's going to inform, how we look at alternatives and the work that's being done. So, okay, I mean, I think there's some homework for us to do. I can help doing this with Brian as well, as put together sort of a more complete example that shows and demonstrates some of these use cases a little bit more, and potentially we can think about different levels or ways of packaging. But I'm going to take that home for homework. But yeah, let's take a look at Gino's example operation definition.
Yeah. Do you want me to share or what's easiest?
Yeah.
My camera's going to be weird for a second. I was not thinking of doing that at all, so I was not set up for it. Give me one moment. There we go. Camera's back. And then I can share that. Maybe. There we go. All right. So yeah, and to what you were just saying, Arjun, I definitely see these as complementary. I don't think that we want to, I tried to be very clear in here that especially for just operations themselves, for the operation type operations, operation kind operations, I should say, there's very little difference. There's some serialization difference, but that's about it. The real thing for me is integration into the search API. So this is just, I should probably do this and pop up a chat window again for that. And so, yeah, this is just, a tossed together example. And I used the same example from Brian's, and that's the link to that one, to the gist. But saying, okay, well, if we want to take the same things we were doing in the library and just wrap it in an operation definition. And so in this case, we're saying, yeah, operation definition, give it the ID, name, code, kind, all that kind of stuff. And same thing, just embed the SQL into it. Then you can, ask to evaluate it just by using the operation, which is just integrated in the API. That said, I can't ever imagine actually taking in raw SQL over a RESTful API and evaluating it myself. I can't imagine ever trying to do that in production. And so what I would lean towards is doing stored procedures. And in this case, we have a lot of alignment because then this walks through and just says doing the same thing. Now, instead of just having the raw SQL statements, let's make it a stored procedure. Okay, that's still pretty straightforward, and we can still evaluate the same way, but then we can add parameters. So like in this case, I said, use the same query, but add an address use parameter that then we can express. This is running. Oh, now it's running. We can evaluate with a stored procedure or an operation parameter that coincides with a stored procedure parameter. And as long as we make sure we understand how those type mappings work, and we would have to do the work to make sure that all makes sense, but then we can just pass those through and evaluate stored procedures with parameters. This should be via operations. There we go. So we don't have to go crazy. Same thing like we were talking about before. Operations don't have to actually return FHIR. So as long as you use the MIME type correctly, whether you want CSV, whether you want NDJSON, whether you want Parquet, obviously expressing support for all these things, we need the feature query stuff that we're working on in its different IG, because it's very hard to interrogate servers for, what types of operations do you support over what types of MIME types and all that kind of stuff today. So we would want to define how all that works. The real payoff then is when you get to that you want to integrate with the search API, because then you do the same thing that you make an operation definition, but the kind is query. So that's this instead of the kind that was operation before. And here we would have to make some decisions. Like in this case, I said, we're going to assume that things just return the patient ID as the query response internally, because there is a little bit of code that has to link this into the filter framework that you set up. And I see that there's some comments here that I haven't even gone through, but essentially it's the same thing, that then you can use this in a standard search. So you can see here that we use the underscore query standard search parameter that we define. We use the same code for the operation. And then we can include or not the parameters based on, how they're defined, min, max, all that kind of normal stuff, which then lets it work as a normal filter, but it'll return the whole patient resource instead of when we were talking up here that we were talking about just returning it in JSON. I did add another section here where we were talking about dialects, and this is something that we have to solve generally, so I probably could have put it in a separate document instead, but I'm lazy. That's, when I was talking with Josh a little bit, who's running around still, but he said, well, I thought we were just keeping everything to core portable SQL, ANSI SQL. And we said, yeah, that sounds great, but if you want to use JSON, if you want to use all these things, we know we can't. And so then when we start getting into that, in this case, I was proposing something we do in a lot of authorization areas and things like that is just make it a tuple that is a codable and the thing you want, in this case, an expression. So put a coding, we define code system for SQL dialects for what we want them to be. And then instead of the extension just being the simple extension that has an expression, it has the tuple of dialect and extension. And you can also make the dialect optional. If you're staying with ANSI SQL, you don't have to put it, things like that. There's other ways you can do it, but this shows an example building out saying, okay, if I built one that's a portable SQL 92 and one's the TSQL version, and this is the PostgreSQL version, you can see that then you could embed all of them together. The serialization is long. It's kind of gross. If we want to embed these better, we can create a logical model and or an additional resource named to be determined at some point in the future if we want a better way of describing all of those things. So that's the quick version. Thoughts, questions, concerns?
Yeah, why not to use language and expression for different dialects? Why you want to create complex?
So yeah, the reason I didn't before, and we can, that's why I wanted to discuss it, is, where is this? No, that's in data types or in metadata types? Expression, metadata types. See, it was right the first time.
System or...
So language is technically bound to, oh no, it is. No, it is. Okay, I thought it was. I hate how they did this. So
I'm a type, so we can use something like this for dialects.
Yes. So there are not individual MIME types for the different dialects of SQL that I could find. I thought about using a parameter. However, technically, parameters have to be, MIME parameters have to be registered, and the SQL MIME type does not have a parameter for the dialect. We could do it anyway, because we can just say we want to do it, but I was a little uncomfortable just saying, oh yeah, we'll just make up a MIME parameter for that, and even though it's not official, we'll use it. But I figured that was part of the thing we can have discussion about. I'm not opposed to it, I just wasn't comfortable pitching it.
At least I saw something like MIME types for Postgres, at least in code highlights. So people like informally doing this.
Yeah, I had I grabbed some examples last time around. I think they're all ad hoc or based on. It's not an official MIME type. I don't think any official MIME types exist other than just SQL. So we will. I think almost guaranteed have to move to this kind of convention-based system. Like there's nothing to lean on.
Yeah, and I was going to continue looking through to see if there's a parameter even on text that we could throw in or something like that and say, well, instead of using...
Is that like SQL plus something, or like that's how there's like...
the parameters are the things after the semicolon.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
These are things that you define when you do the MIME type.
Okay.
In FHIR, we have one, I don't remember which page it's in. Yeah, the MIME type parameter, like here you can see in FHIR, we defined one for FHIR version. So that when you do FHIR plus JSON, you can add a FHIR version parameter. They actually haven't done the homework to make that legal, but we define it in our specs. So, kind of a weird spot. They did register the MIME types officially. So these are official MIME types. It's just that they did not add the things like the parameters. And so that's the point, is people can use parameters and you can put whatever you want, and most middleware and things like that will just pass them through anyway. I always get concerned when we talk about things that might get included in regulation, because people start throwing up things like, hey, this isn't actually valid. And then you run into those weird problems when people are saying, well, we're trying to regulate something and it's not valid.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fairly minor case. Like there's, I think, a couple of different avenues in terms, I mean, I think dialects are important. I've said that before, but like how we express the specific dialects, I think there's a couple of options. I think, well, we might have 3 minutes left, so I don't want to take over the rest of the time. But yeah, I think the other.
There's still third option, which we can think a lot. Maybe just introduce a query resource, because I like the operation. It fits very well, but it will a little bit pollute the operation definitions. Yes, imagine like you have dozens and dozens of queries, and then it is good that we're fitting existing infrastructure, but we still need special extensions to point to the view definitions, which are used in query, and we still have to consider the custom resource for the query, which can be like simple, and discovery will be much easier. So we need to introduce like some label kind for operation definition, so people understand that this is a SQL query and all this stuff. And is it really operation? So I agree that it should be integrated as operation, but not sure that it is always operation.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, I didn't spend too long exploring it just because of time, but same thing. If we want to say like we need named queries, named operations of kind query to integrate into search, well, that's fine. If we wanted to find them in either a library or a query model or whatever we want, we can use a related artifact extension to link back to that definition and avoid redefining everything in the operation itself. So I didn't go through and document all of it because, but I do see Steve, you have your hand up too.
I think you guys are just talking about it, but it's just not completely clear in my mind. How your proposal, Gino, how do you run a query on one of the view definition outputs?
That was part that I didn't. This was
is that the thing we just okay?
Yes.
All right.
That's exactly the kind of thing that we were just talking through to say. This is saying, we started from the point of, here is raw SQL that we want to run.
Gotcha.
We said, we can do all that, and it's kind of integrated here, assuming that you knew the view definitions properly. We're probably need to build more than that. We probably need to explicitly link these to view definitions and things like that. And that's where we probably want to lean more to library and do all those things. The real meat of what I'm most interested in is making sure that we have some way of doing this for the named queries, so that we can integrate into search. Because that would be
really nice for search. Yeah,
exactly. And so then how we actually want to link these to definitions underneath. This was, we're calling it a proposal, but this was just for discussion. This wasn't actually me pitching this.
Sure.
So is the idea you could combine multiple view definitions in like one sort of go?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you can use multiple, because we said that you can join in query, and that's what's going to happen. So
that's kind of cool.
So in this case, we're saying there's a patient demographics view definition and a patient addresses view definition, and they're linked via these that both happen to be patient ID. They wouldn't have to be, but yeah, you just run them and do all that stuff so that you can build up the more complicated uses.
Very cool. Yeah, sorry, I was double dipping. I was on 2 calls at the same time. So apologies if you already covered that.
I know we're over time, so people have to drop, but I do have one question for Gino. I have you so if, let's say we went down the individual query resource logical model routes, how would that be expressed, or how would that be integrated into the operation definition search use case that you're showing here. Can you just like point me to where it would look?
Yeah, the way I would do it is using this, the related artifact. So essentially, when you go and we still have to make an operation definition at some point.
So you need that.
But instead of here, in this example, here we have an extension for the SQL expression. Instead, I would replace this with related artifact and say, yeah, it's the same thing. We have an operation definition, but instead of having SQL or SQL here, it just points to some sort of related artifact, one or more. If we need to be more specific, we could be more specific. If we use a library or something like that, then same thing. We can use the library mechanisms to say, you know, it's using this SQL statement out of this library, and the library establishes all the links. You know, we can build up through there. And so that's where I'm saying, yep.
Got it. So it would essentially say, well, if I repeat that, it was sort of this indirection layer, right, between the source. Like right now in this document for discussion, like you kind of have a query resource wearing a t-shirt that says operation definition. So, you know, but with an extension. Maybe the extension is, you know, your clothes, but yeah, I'm just trying to understand how those would fit together. So in that case, it would be operation definition. It'd be, you know, a level of indirection through related artifact to, you know, really
get the
really well tailored query resource or whatever we're thinking of that there, and then that query resource obviously could be packaged to library as content, right? As many times, and then. You're also saying I need to look at it a little more closely, but you would be able to, like, let's say you referred to a library with a number of query resources in the operation definition. You could sort of index into a specific piece of content or whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I generally want to avoid reinventing things because same thing. We could just as easily say, well, instead of using underscore query, which is predefined, we could make underscore SQL, you know, and link those directly into query resources or something like that.
Yeah, but to be honest, with the query, it doesn't work 100% because the result of the query is not the FHIR resource again, and the like underscore query should return the FHIR resource. Yes, so that's small mistake.
And so that is one of the differences I highlight here, that if you're saying you want to get back ND-JSON, you want to directly do an operation. And I think I said here that somewhere that it's like, this is no different than query and run and everything else. So I'm just putting it here again for discussion because it doesn't have any actual things except for parameters. And that's something that, you know, this mechanism for how to take parameters from an operation and map them into other things is already defined. If we want to build our own way of doing it, we have to do it ourselves. But in query and run, it's using operation definition, doing the same thing. So again, to me, that's not too big of a deal one way or the other. This is the one to me that this already has all the things for converting search types and passing them through and all of that. And to me, that's the big thing, is saying, if you want to express very complicated SQL logic for filtering that you want to integrate into the search API, because you want to be able to say, you know, give me the patients that are in this cohort that is very complicated, you know, design of, you know, patients who've had a particular condition in the last 6 months and been hospitalized in the last year and have taken this medication and blah, 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 blah. Right now, if you want to define the query filter for that, you end up defining this same type of thing without the SQL. And that's it, and leave it up to everyone to figure out how to implement it themselves. And there are plenty of places that are doing that today for complicated things. They define these operations and say you're on your own on how to actually implement them. And so to me, being able to say, well, you implement them by doing this and using a stored procedure that does these filters and returns the patient ID. And if we can agree on those pieces, then when you want to define those very complicated logics that you want to use for filtering in your FHIR queries, you get it for free.
It's still not contradict even if we introduce query resource finally, yes, because you may from operation definition the query resource.
Yep, same thing, and that's why, just like we're saying, if we want to do a query resource, I would say same thing. We just put an extension for related artifact and point to the query resource. If we want to say these are parts of a library, that's all very well defined with all the CRMI and everything else to say how you point to a library and how you point to I don't remember what it's called inside of a library, a method or a whatever inside a library. So again, I want to pick, if we're talking that we probably need the more complicated, which is where I've gotten to in this call, I think, then I would much rather piggyback as much as we can without redefining all of it, because that's a lot of extra work.
Definitely can, but still, I would still think about like separate query resource, because it will be much more readable, yes, and discoverable.
I think so.
If you put everything into extensions, this is not the best way to, like not very friendly way for the people, yes, to think about this. So.
Yes, and I think especially as we get into things like dialects, something between libraries and something between query resource and things like that, I think is going to be critical, because this is terrible to me to actually try and use. And I hate the extension mechanism. That's why I push so much for the additional resources anyway, is just because parsing all of these things are string matching over arrays and all that kind of stuff, which is very not performant. You're not doing it all the time, so it's not that big of a deal, but it makes my heart sad.
Yeah, but it's less readable, yes, like less pleasant for the eyes.
Yeah.
I just sketched the like additional resource for the query. If you would like, I can show it very quickly just to.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, screen share. It's not what I want to show. It may look like this. Yes, so I don't know. What about name? It could be query, SQL query, query definition. We say resource definition is additional resource. It is query. Like we may say the set of views we depends on. There's a big problem with the names of views, yes, because names in a query should match to the names of view definition, and we not yet decided what should be the name of the view definition in the final database, yes. So here can be additional mapping provided, and we can use like the parameter way to introduce some kind of parameters into the query. And then we can, so it's still the option. It's much more readable. Yes, we can introduce dialects or like say languages or dialects. We can even say this is always SQL, yes, and just a dialect. So, and we can still consider this option. And this query resource can be packed into the library, cannot be attached to the operation definitions, but it looks a little bit cleaner for me.
A lot cleaner, yes. I am very much in favor of doing things that way. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, let's do some homework and then take some of these back, flesh them out, put together something, the use case examples. I think the clinical reasoning examples and then the FHIR search examples. I think those are like the two poles here. But yeah, I think we have enough to go forward on and sketch out and document what a proposal might look like going forward. Does that work for folks?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
We can collaborate. Okay.
Yeah, works for me.
Yeah, great. And thanks for putting up your discussion draft too. That was really helpful. That helped move things forward a lot.
Straw man is useful.
Awesome. All right. I know we're over time, but anything else, or we can call it a day?
I know, Steve, are you blocked with this run stuff?
I put together a quick PR. We're moving ahead on it, but your answer was helpful. I put a little bit of clarifying enhancements in the documentation. We can probably chat about it some other time.
Yeah, and feel free just to like make the pull request. I think for run operation, we should be able to provide parameter resource, like multiple resources. So if people are debugging the view definition, you can just supply the data as well. Not and about
through source.
Not through the source. Source for me was just some name, some convention between like implementers and users. You may say I have 3 buckets with the data, yes, and bucket 1, bucket 2, and bucket 3, and you can just give me the name of this bucket. But if you want to run operation against like 10 of resources, like let's say we want to run our test suits, then we're sending in parameter multiple resource parameters. So you say here is a view definition, the first parameter, and the second parameter is a resource, third parameter is a resource, and so on.
As a bundle then.
As a parameter resource, because you can bundle resources inside parameter. And we decided to go with the parameters. Yeah.
Okay.
So you can just sending multiple parameter with a name resource, I don't know, something like this, and the body of the resources for the debug.
Okay.
If it's not sent, then the server using internal storage.
Okay, then I was confused. There's no resource parameter defined.
Yeah. I will do this. I will think about this when we talk with Brian about FHIR lab. So people want to debug, they want to debug on their own data, yes, so not data on the server. Sometimes for the test. So, and we should support both scenarios when you're running on your data or when the data are supplied with the run operation, especially for debug and designing stuff.
Yeah, I put 3 PRs together. You can do with them what you wish. Some are very simple documentation improvements. But do you want to then add the resource parameter?
Yeah. If you can, please do that, because I was focused on implementation. I didn't. I didn't update documentation a lot.
Okay, I'm trying to catch up to where you. I'm trying to catch up to where you are. So.
And I will fix this reference implementation for that. Yeah, let's work together. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, sounds good. So we'll call it there. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.